Just imagine living around 100 people continuously in a high-stress situation where you are surrounded by fear, unknown, darkness, and there are people out there who desperately want to kill you. And imagine all of a sudden a shot rings out or an explosion takes place, and friends of yours are now on the ground screaming, a leg is gone or they're shot. A helicopter comes and takes them away, and you never know what happened to them. You had no way to find out if they lived or died, where they were from, or anything. Years later, as you thought back on the war, as you relived that particular incident when your friend was wounded, you were frustrated because you never were able to find out what happened to him. This person literally disappeared in your life.
You've been watching Vietnam veteran David Bowman, who back in 1989 did this interview with me, talking about why the Vietnam Wall meant something to him and his buddies. I'm David Hoffman, independent documentary filmmaker, and I did this interview with David back in 1989 as part of 200 interviews I was doing on people's experiences back in the 1960s. You're about to hear David tell you his extraordinary experience, because when he got out, when he came back, he became a San Francisco cop and a street cop in 1968 and 1969. Those were very rough years in San Francisco, as you're about to hear. If this has meaning for you, could you please click the super thanks below the video screen on the right side? It supports my efforts and allows me to present more of these interviews, Vietnam vets and others who grew up at that time. Thank you, viewers. Thank you, David.
When did you say it's done? Or for you it was done, for you personally?
It had to have been 1975. You have to remember my 1960s incorporated my years in the service, and the extension of that being the war, the demonstrations, the radicalism in the United States. That didn't end, that cause, end the war, NLF is going to win, ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, didn't end until South Vietnam fell. And when it fell and the war was over, at that point, the 1960s ended for me, because the war finally ended as a war. And then it was put away for many, many years in a trunk, in an attic, and recently opened.
You didn't talk about it for a long time.
In the police department we did. And I used what I had learned and what knowledge I had gained, both in Vietnam and in this late 60s, early 70s, to help the officers now coming into the department. You have to remember, in 1975, 76, and that time, those officers weren't in the service. The draft had ended, the war was over. They were just coming out of school. They didn't understand what they may face out there when they faced a gunman. So I was charged, as were some other people, with trying to teach them how to protect themselves. I went into the police department in 1969, and in February of 1970, I was assigned to Park Police Station in San Francisco, which was the station charged with patrolling the Haight-Ashbury district of San Francisco. The radical underground was in full swing and had been for several years, and a few months prior, the Ingleside Police District Station, or precinct, had been bombed by a pipe bomb being placed on a windowsill, and several officers were killed. We had officers being assassinated, shot on the street for no reason. There was not a crime taking place. We were being sought out and shot indiscriminately. So the stations erected these enormous fences, chain link fences around them, about 10, 12, 15 foot tall, and installed lights facing outward. And it became another hilltop base camp. And I found myself working the midnight shift, and I would arrive at midnight, and I was given an M16 rifle. And I walked outside the police station, just outside the lights, outside of the fence, and I would patrol because the station was inside of Golden Gate Park. We were surrounded by trees and undergrowth, and there I was, back in Vietnam, protecting a base camp. on the East Bay of San Francisco, the People's Republic of Berkeley. And we, the San Francisco Tactical Squad officers, would have to get onto San Francisco Municipal Railway buses and be bussed over to People's Republic to help the Berkeley Police Department because their department was so small. When it got out of hand and we, the multi-jurisdiction departments, couldn't handle it, then they called in the National Guard, as in the case of People's Park. People went out and they carried signs and they chanted. When they went beyond that, where they were taking over areas, they were not allowing normal civilians to walk through. They would block roadways and arteries. They would break windows of stores and then start throwing things. Then it became the riot. We were at war.
Yeah.
But in a way, I think it helped me, because you have to remember that a lot of the combat infantrymen who returned from Vietnam returned from massive assaults to your being, your psyche, and then cut off and sent back into a world in which they had no control. I was sent back, and then I went into the police department. My war continued, and I was weaned off of it over a period of probably 6 or 7 years. As the war wound down, radicalism wound down, and then I moved on to something else in the police department, into investigations. So my war, I was gradually weaned off war, where others weren't. And I think it helped me as far as traumatic stress and those kinds of things. You have to remember that the people who were in that counterculture, particularly the people who were really politically involved, in the Haight-Ashbury, where I was working, had the term I used to use is they conformed in the nonconformity. They didn't wash. They didn't change their clothes. They smelled. They had dirt all over them. They'd walk the streets, and they were doing drugs, and they were very, very unkempt, sloppy, and they had a whole different world, and I wanted no part of that. It's not like you just had long hair and a granny-type dress on, and it was clean. It wasn't that way. Yeah. And they were, to describe some of the craziness, at Park Station I remember standing outside, and a couple drove up in a huge school bus. At that time, the city was loaded with Volkswagen vans and school buses, and they lived in a school bus, and they carried this bundled package into Park Police Station. I was in front. I walked in with them into the station. They opened up the bundled package, and it was a dead baby. They were leaving the city and going off to a commune in the country, and they wanted to turn this in like, wow, man, we can't handle this anymore, and we wanted to give you this, and we're leaving, and you take care of it for us. And it didn't, I couldn't understand that they didn't feel the parental feelings towards this child. They were just discarding another thing in their life that they didn't need as they moved off into the country to a commune. Obviously, we didn't let them go. But the way I think about it is not knowing what you saw or what the audience sees, the people in the lens of that camera. I feel that what I've seen is probably what a lot of people have seen. I can't understand what you've seen. I can't walk in your shoes. I wasn't there. I only know what I know. And I saw a lot, but then again, so did a lot of people. There are other people who saw more, who suffered more. I was wounded, but slightly in Vietnam. I have friends now who have lost limbs and just literally are destroyed, both physically and psychologically. They lost a lot more than I did.
I want to ask you a very important question about the Vietnam War Memorial. I want to talk to you about what that memorial meant when you saw it, what it means to you, the symbol of it.
It's important more than being a piece of stone with names on it. You have to remember that before the memorial was erected and the commission was charged with the responsibility of organizing and building it, there was no way for the veteran to find his buddies. We had no source of finding it. The government never told us how we could find a friend or the family of a friend who died, so we could explain to them what happened and how we tried to help them. We had no way. There was no vehicle. And if there was a vehicle out there, we were never told how to get aboard. Finally, you knew the full name of your buddy and where he was from. And if you wanted to carry it further, then you could contact the town to find out, contact the newspaper for an obituary and get a hold of the family and talk to them. I did that several times.
You did?
Several times. I had friends who I knew by only a last name or a first name, and I knew when they died and that they were from Utah, let's say. So when the book came out, when the wall was there, I was able to look up that date because the wall is built in chronological order. That's how it is set out, not by alphabetical order. I looked at the date, and then I looked in the book to find out the states of the people who died in that particular day. And then I could find them. I had very close friends who disappeared. And now, all these years later, 20 some odd years later, I'm finally able to find out and find them.
Today, do you distrust the government because of what you've been through? Do you have a healthy suspicion, or you say, boy, they don't always tell you the truth or whatever? I mean, I'm interested to know what this has all done to you.
Because I now realize that everything that was told to me in the early 1960s and before I went into the military in 1967 wasn't necessarily the whole truth. I am skeptical about what I hear and what I read in the paper. And I try to look at it in a total picture rather than just a specific event. And I try to piece things together and see what's happening before I make any determination about a statement that is said by a public official. There are a lot of extenuating circumstances that are going by. Obviously, they know a lot of things that we don't know that are taking place and the reasons that they are doing things and what goal they're trying to achieve. We are not privy to that information. I saw a lot of that when I worked on the presidential motorcades when I was in the tactical unit, when Nixon was president, when Ford was president, and how they operated. But I read the news and I watch the statements, and one of the things that comes to mind is, I wonder what the real story is and what the big picture is.
Do you feel on balance the 60s was a good time for you? Are you glad to have lived through it? Do you feel it was good, or do you feel on balance it was a lousy time and you're glad it's over?
Oh, because of the difficulties in my family, it was a very difficult time for me. My mother remarried a man who he and I did not get along. That was a miserable time for me. And going from that into a suffering student in San Francisco working full-time and supporting myself through college and trying to fend off the draft board that was continually trying to grab me, and then going into the service and being thrust into the front line at the height of the war during the Tet Offensive, during the Quezon invasion, and then coming home and going to the police department, it was a very difficult time. It was a crazy time.